Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got myself, LeBrad. I don't know why I went with that today, but and then Tyler, of course. So today we're going to be talking about Tales from the Trenches. We occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, will come out with an episode where we talk about stories from our pen testing adventures and lessons learned and basically just kind of, it's a good time, it's fun to talk about, and some of these are really interesting. So before we get into that, quick admin: if you like what we're doing here, please like, subscribe, share. The most important thing you can do for us is tell a friend about what we're trying to do here, just spreading the word about, cybersecurity and specifically pen testing stuff. So I'll go first. This is something that was kind of a new learn for me. So for those of you out there that don't know, my specialty is web app pen testing, and so I do everything more or less, internal, external, mobile. Actually, probably not mobile, but that has evolved so much since I did a mobile pen test. But luckily, we have somebody for that. But anyway, long story short is I'm kind of a general practitioner, but my specialty and where I got into pen testing was in the web world, and so um, that kind of is very interesting to me. That's why two of my three stories today are web based. And so, anyway, a couple months ago, we were working on an application. I think it was a origination application, and if you don't know what that word means in the financial world, it's basically how you open something. It can be creating a bank account, it can be opening a mortgage, it can be creating a credit card, whatever. But the financial term for it is origination, like where it begins in the process of like approval and issuance and all that stuff. And so this particular application was a third party hosted, managed for a financial institution. And so anyway, long story short is we're getting through the application, and we saw this one request kind of early on in the process that was making a request to GraphQL. So let's talk about what GraphQL is really quick. It's basically a data query manipulation language designed for APIs. But here's the cool thing: it allows the client to basically ask for whatever it wants. To me, as a pen tester, when I read that, and by the way, that's technically the description from their like webpage, right? And so literally the last half of the very first introductory sentences, you can just ask for whatever you want. Well, that's exactly what we did, right? And that's what makes GraphQL dangerous. It's also a really cool, um, it's a really cool, I would call it an abstraction layer between the API or the web application and the data source. Um, and so, but what I mean by abstraction is it kind of intercepts a request, interprets it, and then goes and it does it. And so it basically means you can have multiple different types of data stores. So you could have 10 different databases, or you could have a MySQL and a MSSQL database. So it's a really cool, versatile, I would call it a library or a set of tools. However, because you can ask for whatever the heck you want, what we noticed is early on in the request, we saw this one request being repeated at the beginning of the workflow of the application, and then it was an API endpoint calling to a GraphQL instance. And what it responded back with was a JSON web token, which is another one of my stories later. But when we blew up the web token, we realized that web token was permissioned as administrator. Like it literally, the name of the user was admin.
Mm,
And so long story short, we're like, okay, we're on to something here, right? And so one of the interesting, I'm not going to call it a vulnerability, let's call it a feature of GraphQL, is that if you can gain access to the schema, it's roughly the equivalent of enumerating the database schema from a SQL injection perspective, right? So it's a shortcut for hackers. So they had kind of disabled introspection, which is the revealing of the schema. And so we were able to get around the few very basic security mechanisms they had in place and ultimately enumerated the entire schema. And what's cool about that is GraphQL is very verbose in its responses, which you can disable, but by default it's turned on. So what's really cool is you'll make a query, And GraphQL will come back and be like, yeah, that didn't really work. Is this what you meant? And so it literally feeds you additional information to help you build queries. And so long story short, what we realized is that that admin token was valid across multiple clients. And so we were able to then query other client data sources beyond the one who hired us. So imagine you have this like third party who specializes in origination, and they are probably partners with dozens of banks or other type of entities. And so we were able to access literally everything.
So that was a universal JWT that was being used across multiple environments.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah. And so once you got into, the application a little bit deeper, you got your own JWT. And that one was limited to the scope in which you were working, right? It was
Hmm.
basically your user that you create, excuse me, and you could only talk to those things, but if you captured that early token, which is what was being used to get the second token, then you could do anything you wanted. And so obviously it's fixed now. They were very responsive, great people to work with. It was just one of those cool things about GraphQL that, and anytime we hear GraphQL in conversations about a web app pen test, we get excited, right? Because there are a million ways to do it wrong, and there's one way to do it right. And so it's very difficult to get right. And so, cautionary tale about GraphQL, as cool and sexy as it is, um, you can mess it up pretty easily. So that was a fun exercise. All right, your turn.
So mine was actually very recent. It was around an SMTP relay I
Mhm.
found, which is
Yep.
actually the first one I found that was misconfigured to the point that I could actually send and receive as an arbitrary person
Yeah.
in the domain. It's very rare to see that. I see SMTP publicly facing all the time,
Yeah.
um, which isn't a huge deal unless, you have it as an open relay and anybody can do anything they want with it.
That's
But
tough.
it wasn't on their IP ranges. It was actually one of the subdomains that I pulled for the client I was working with. And I always go back through and I map those just because in additional web ports, usually some of those have SSH, FTP, in this case, SMTP open. So I want to double check for those ports as well, not just web ports. And so that subdomain actually only had 25 open. So MX Toolbox is a tool that I use to do an SMTP check, and it'll check for things like start TLS to make sure that TLS is available on that SMTP server. And then it also checks for open relays as a first pass. So I plugged it in there and I saw it was an open relay, and that, excited me obviously because I haven't seen one of those in forever.
See, I would have been
So
thinking false positive right off the top because it's such a rare find, but
what actually it shows you the output, and so I saw the 250 response from the server, so I was like, cool, I want to test it now.
yep.
Um, so I wrote up probably just 20-line script that sent me a test email from me, um, and I got that email and I was like, cool, cool. Um, and so I think that's one that they're still working on a fix for. So I have no idea when that'll happen, but it was really cool to actually have some port abuse and be able to successfully do that.
Yeah, dude. So what's the big risk, right? So what's the hate on open relays?
It's a reputational risk, in my opinion,
Yeah.
because your mail server is being abused by other people. And so they can do whatever they want with that mail server, and it's got that client's name attached to it. Um,
Right.
their IP, their subdomain is sending email to whoever from whoever. So I think it's really a reputational risk there.
Yeah, and I will tell you, a number of years ago, when I was working at a financial entity, we we started getting our client email communications blacklisted, and so we were actually getting marked as spam. And it turned out a similar type situation where there was a spammer who was literally leveraging our SMTP server to send out millions and millions of spam emails. And so it actually had a pretty significant impact on our ability to communicate with clients, right? Because how many people get stuff in the mail, right? Like I get stuff in the mail rarely, Now, if my bank's communicating with me or 401k or whatever it is, it's an email, right? It's like, hey, go
Mhm.
log into your portal. You have a notification, whatever. So you can imagine how big of a deal that is for like $100 billion bank to no longer be able to send client notifications, right? Um, and we've seen other clients get hit with stuff like that too. So yeah, I mean, reputational and by extension of that could actually be like operational risk.
Mm.
It could impact your ability to do business, especially if you're. I mean, man, we have a couple of clients like whose whole job it is to email communicate with clients. For on behalf of other companies, and so I cannot imagine what that would do to them.
Well, the other
Um,
risk is, that sender, I should have double checked their SPF record to see if that was a safe sender in their list because it also presents a direct social engineering risk to the
mm,
organization that SMTP server spawns from.
oh
Because if
yeah.
that is a safe sender, then you can pose as whoever, and that email is not going to get flagged as suspicious and it's going to look legitimate. So, that's another avenue there as well.
Well, I would ask this question, right? If was it hosted on one of their on-prem or was it off-premise,
It
the
was
email
off
server?
prem.
It was off. Okay. Well, here's the reason I ask is if it were on-prem or if it's routing directly into their internal environment or into their email system, it may bypass those DNS text records and the check for external configurations like SPF, DKIM, DMARC. And so we're actually seeing that on other platforms like Proofpoint and Exchange Online, where you can back channel emails and they don't even check those records. So I was wondering, yeah, if it's off prem, it's probably routing through its own email server before it reaches whatever the client is using for email. So it
Mm.
probably would still have to check SPF. But anyway, yeah, man, big deal, big deal. And as a side note, you're also contributing to potentially to spammers and other bad guys on the internet by giving them an open relay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just goes to show that you should always check everything
Oh
regardless of the
yeah.
port that's open, because ideal, dude, I've probably seen 20 or 30 SMTP ports open recently,
Mhm.
and every time it's the same check, and they always come back negative, and,
So it would have been easy just to be like,
check it
yeah,
anyway.
whatever SMTP, it's fine.
Yep.
Hey man, that just speaks to the thoroughness of the work, really. But yeah, and let's talk about SMTP also along the same vein of other um, let's call it services or ports I don't want to see on the public internet. Right? Like there
Mm,
is almost never a reason to have SMTP exposed to the public internet. We don't live in that world anymore. I would say the same goes for things like SSH, FTP. Um, I just don't love seeing those on the public internet anymore. And the reason, at least what we tell clients, the reason is um, there are no mechanisms for protection, right? Like if I'm password spraying your M365 environment, there are multiple layers and opportunities for you to catch the password spray, deal with it
mhm.
potentially, or even detect bad logons, right? There's literally something called risky sign-ins
Yep.
that's a rule. And you can protect it with things like MFA and things like conditional access. You can't do any of that stuff with SMTP, FTP, SSH. Those are direct connect protocols. And yeah, you can use keys or strong passwords, but you're still not putting MFA on it,
Yep.
and you have no monitoring capability for what activity is happening on those services.
Yeah, the thing that's made me more comfortable with SSH being public facing is majority of the people I see with SSH public facing have certificate based authentication. There's no
Yeah,
username and password, so brute force doesn't even work anymore
right.
on a lot of what I'm seeing. So not a complete compensating control, but better
It's
than
pretty
the
good though.
alternative.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I can live with that. I can live with that. Um, but anyway, so yeah, man, we see this stuff all the time. Those ports and protocols, but not open relays. That's pretty
Yeah, that's
wild. Yeah.
rare. That's
I can't
rare.
I can't remember the last time I saw that, man. I've been doing this for a few minutes, and I can't remember the last time I've seen an open relay. Um, all right, so I've got another one for you, and this is really more of a broad discussion about APIs, right? So in the web world and even in the mobile world, everything's got an API behind it. It's probably more rare now to get a hold of an application that does not have an API exposed.
Mm,
And so, for those of you that aren't familiar, generally speaking, an API is really just a dumb web app, right? And so there's usually for web there's a user interface. It's pretty. It's got a bunch of JavaScript and does all this fancy cool looking stuff. But behind it, all it's really doing is making structured JSON requests to an API endpoint, which is abstracting the data layer. So behind that, so instead of the web app making the call to the database, it calls the API, which whose job it is to sanitize, structure, and then respond with the results from the data layer. And so we see a ton of this. The problem, or some of the problems that we're seeing with API endpoints is they don't really have good security mechanisms for handling things like authorization, enumeration, velocity attacks, things like that. What do I mean? Well, usually, when you're communicating with API, we mentioned JWTs earlier. Let's just kind of quickly delve into that. It's a JSON web token, and it's basically this big long glob of three different pieces of information, right? You've got a header, a body, and then the encryption signature. When implemented correctly, the header basically just calls out, the structure format and what the encryption mechanism will be. The body usually contains some information about the user or the session, which is usually it's got like a username, and maybe something else depending on. You can put a lot of shit in there, right? We're going to talk about that. But anyway, and then the end is kind of the signature, right? It's going to be the what validates the body more or less of the JWT. What's cool about them though is you can blow them up, and what I mean is like expand them out, right? So when we get a JWT, it almost always starts with like EYJ, right? That's how we identify that it's a JWT. And so we throw that in, we decode it, and we can now read in plain text what the content of the JWT is. Trouble with that is when people start putting too much stuff in there. And so we have in the past seen JWTs that you could tamper with. And so there are a couple reasons this can happen. First of all, I may be able to change my username, right? Because you can edit a JWT and send it to the server. You can do whatever you want with it. The server's supposed to be checking the header and the footer, or checking the header and the signature to make sure that the content has not been tampered with. That is an optional step. And a lot of people don't realize that unless you explicitly tell that API endpoint to validate that JWT, it may just blow it up, read content, move on. And so we've been able to elevate privileges and take over accounts by just modifying the username. Or in some cases, the group membership will be part of the JWT body, and we can modify group memberships and give ourselves elevated privileges within an application. You can, in some cases, there's something called key confusion attack. There's also the ability to set the signature to none, which is basically just saying, hey, don't worry about a signature. It's fine. So you change these in the header. And unless the server is enforcing those things, you can get around some of those protections. So that's the JWT aspect. And the reason I wanted to spend some time explaining that is almost the only security mechanism that exists around API endpoints. Right behind the scenes, you got input validation and things of that nature. But for the most part, that's the only thing standing between an API endpoint and successfully calling that endpoint. All right. So getting the JWT is the first half of the battle. Once you have that, though, there's not a good way to protect endpoints from enumeration, usually through what we call it velocity protections or velocity attacks. What we're really doing there is sending millions of requests over a series of time to enumerate patterns in values. And you actually ran into that, I think, last week, where we found user IDs that were being sequentially returned by an API. And what's dangerous about that is now we can predict user IDs, right? We can also retroactively guess what previous user IDs were. And so those, that vulnerability expands much beyond just user IDs. It could be anything. It could be account numbers. It could be, you know, document IDs, so we can retrieve documents that don't belong to us. And so when you start thinking about the challenges of that, APIs present some pretty tough challenges with regards to protection, right? And so it is a frequent finding that we see on on APIs where we have velocity testing or enumeration capabilities because there's not proper authorization, or just the endpoint was designed to return data, man. It's what its job is, and we're just leveraging that to enumerate records. So anyway, that was a long journey to get to the point of like, hey, we can find things.
Yeah, I think that fits into my next one well. More so than just user enumeration, is just general enumeration. It's
Yeah.
kind of my bread and butter. It's just what I love to do. Um, there's been plenty of times this past year where I've ran into overly verbose APIs where
Yeah.
you're just making simple authentication requests, or you're clicking in a forgot password and sending stuff there, and then the API is just dumping all this data about the user that you tried to authenticate as or
Yep.
try to reset their password as. So overly verbose APIs are something I love as well.
Definitely.
Um, any user enumeration endpoint as well. Every time I test a web app on an external, which sounds weird, they coincide a lot, but every time I test a web app on an external, I'm testing every single endpoint that you can authenticate to on that web app.
Yep.
Because there's more than just, the base username, password, login field. There's a forgot password field. There's a forgot username field. And a lot of the times, the more you interact with them, the more you see on the back end where those requests are going and where they're being handled by. And then, 9 times out of 10, it's an API communicating back to somewhere else to verify authentication.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can coerce, tamper, play with different values and get, different information from that. So I think that's something that I do on every engagement that I look forward to. I think my past two haven't had any. All the endpoints I've seen are very secure. Like things like
Good.
Okta have really ramped up their game against things like user enumeration, but more so than just API responses, just um, responses to your authentication attempt saying,
Yeah.
that password did not match that username for a valid user, and then saying that's not a known user. Those are,
Right.
another point for enumeration that I also like.
I've also seen along that same vein. Actually, I think it was Jordan that had one last week where it would respond back and say, "Hey, you only have 3 more attempts before the user's locked out." But it only says that for valid users. If you put in an invalid user, it just says unknown user and password. And so, a lot of folks might overlook something like that. But for us, man, that's just fantastic. And like you mentioned, also password reset fields or forms.
Mm.
Dude, I love seeing password reset forms, especially like self-service and stuff like that, because we've run into situations where what is needed for the password reset is mostly public, you know. And we've also seen applications give out internal information too on that same note, right? So we had one a while back, which was I think it was a university, and when you put in the email address, it would respond back with, "Hey, we're logging into this app with your student ID. Here's your student ID."
Yeah.
And so, like, we actually use that form not to try to brute force login. We use that form to enumerate user IDs, and because we were able to figure out what the email pattern was,
Mhm.
and we got hundreds and hundreds of internal student IDs that we were then able to leverage to get into the environment. But um, and so you mentioned something earlier, and it kind of piqued my interest. So I want a side mission on this just a little bit. I just recorded a podcast with the OWASP podcast, an episode with the OWASP podcast, and we were talking about the state of pen testing. And one of the things we talked about is how external pen tests have almost turned into web pen tests.
Mhm.
And so you mentioned that a minute ago. So what are you doing for web apps on externals? And how is that different from like a web app pen test, like a fully blown web pen test?
Mm. Yeah, so we're not going as deep as a full-blown web pen test will do. We're going against the OWASP top 10 typically when we're doing externals. So we're hitting the key points on all the web apps, but we're not pulling on every strand on every web app we see because there's
Yeah,
just not enough time in a day.
sure.
Um, so we're doing basic checks against OWASP top 10 to make sure that security's up to par. But generally, when you do that, you're going to run into an issue or two on that web app that says, hey, security's not great here. You might want a full blown web app. Um, so it doesn't, I don't want to say it provides as much value as a full blown web app when you just do an external because you're
Yeah.
not going as deep, but it still gives you insight into how your app looks to
Yep.
someone like me that only scrapes the surface.
Yep. And we don't do, for the most part, we don't do authenticated testing on web apps. And so when we do a full blown web app pen test, like we get credentials, usually credentials across all roles, and it's like a week or more. Like some of these web apps can take a long time. And but you're right though, and this is something that's really important to take away from this conversation is we can usually tell if the web app is a dumpster fire, right? Without even logging in. We can tell by the messages we're getting back. We can tell, when we put like, we tamper with parameters in the URL and we start getting 500s back. We can tell pretty quick if it's rolled up well or it's not. And that I think is the important takeaway for what we're looking for. And I'm not an advocate of OWASP top 10 as a testing checklist, but it is the best thing that we have, and it does cover the majority, because technically, by the way, if you look at the OWASP top 10, it's more like the OWASP top 6, because like several of them are kind of repeats in my opinion.
Mm.
But encompassed in those 6 are things like lack of input validation. Well, dude, that's like 400 checks, man. You know what I mean? That can be
Mm-hmm.
that can be a million different things. And so it is a verbose test. It's not going to be authenticated. It's not going to be like you said, as deep as it would be for a full blown one, but we should get a good idea. So yeah, no, that was a good. I just want to touch on that because it feels to me like our externals have morphed into a whole bunch of baby web pen tests.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, we're still looking at network stuff and we're looking at SaaS and cloud and all that stuff too. But like, it feels like the majority of what we interact with is web, unless they have an open SMTP relay.
Well, the majority of what you're going to see is just 8443 and 8443 on your externals anyway. So majority of the ports that
Yep.
you're looking to abuse are web-based ports.
Yeah.
But I wanted to step back to the user enum because something I forgot about that I also love, law firms and universities are two of my favorite targets.
I know where you're going with this.
HTML enumeration is something I do that a lot of clients don't like because they're like, we can't do anything about that. And I'm like, I get it, but you're also listing, like a few weeks ago, we had a handoff meeting with a client and I was going over my HTML enumeration finding. And they're like, yeah, I mean, that probably got 90% of our users, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I'm like, well, it's kind of a problem that 90% of your users are just listed on your public website.
Yeah.
So law firms in specific, that's a huge vector for me. Something I love to do. Something I have a script that's universal because all law firms have the same page typically, with a mail to tag. And so that's all I do is just scrape that. But more than that, typically they always have an about me page for their lawyers. And so more than just getting their email and their phone number, you can actually get information about them, where they grew up, went to school, things of that nature that can be useful if they're utilizing like Microsoft's password reset portal, which you can use security questions on as a verification method. Universities as well, if they have sports, a website dedicated to their sports teams, typically those always have every person on every team, both male and female, and it also lists out biographies, parents,
Yes.
siblings, birthdays. So that's also been another vector that we've used for successful social engineering because it's really easy to pretend to be someone when you have all their information already.
Yep.
And typically password reset processes through things like IT help desk are using public information such as birthdays or student IDs or, X, Y, and Z that we have from those types of things.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think the user enumeration is such a larger issue than people realize. And so let's do this thought experiment. Okay. We go to these law firms and we're like, hey man, we can, and let's include OneDrive enum,
Yeah.
right? In that conversation, we can basically go enumerate all of the emails for everybody internally to your organization. And so if we went to any of these clients and said, hey, I can steal your global address book, they would absolutely hit the floor,
It's a little
right?
bit more concerning.
Right, but it's the same thing,
It's the
dude. That's
same
that's what
thing.
I'm
Yep.
getting at, right? Is that if I were to tell someone that I was able to get into their, M365 environment and yoink their global address book, which by the way is literally a flag when we compromise an M365 account. It's something that we go for. They would absolutely be upset, you know. And then by contrast, when we go to them and we're like, we can enumerate all your email addresses, most of your users, their names, their phone numbers, and they're like, whatever.
It's public information.
Right. So interesting thought experiment that those two things kind of hit different for folks. Um, but yeah, man, I mean, I understand their perspective. I understand our perspective. You know, a lot of these companies, a lot of these organizations deal with, have to deal with having that information publicly available. So, I mean, I understand it.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, if you're a small law firm, you have 50 total users and the only emails we're able to scrape is 20, there's a
Yeah.
lot lower chance of success from any type of credential attack than there is if I'm able to enumerate every user via your website, OneDrive enumeration, or just by
Yeah.
scraping.
Yeah.
So, you know, having 100 more users makes such a substantial difference on a successful credential attack, and
Oh,
people
yeah,
kind of
dude.
just brush over that fact and they're like, well, it's public information anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. I had another story, but I think this is a more important conversation for us. And I'll save this one for another episode. But um, I read somewhere somebody smarter than me wrote an article about how identities are the new endpoints. What does that mean? Well, in the early stages of the computer security world, everybody was attacking services and ports, right? Then we introduced these fancy thing called firewalls, and all of a sudden that became a lot less appetizing. And then
Mhm.
they started going after the endpoint and delivering, malware via email or via links through whatever. And it has evolved now. And most people, whether it's intentional or not, are moving more toward a zero trust type environment. Okay, which usually means you have a single SSO across multiple applications, right? Single sign-on where you log into M365 and now you're authenticated to 20 different apps, right? But what that means is the only thing between a bad guy and all of your apps and your data
Mhm.
is an identity, right? It's a user account, a password, maybe MFA. And so, I think we need to understand the current threat landscape when we're talking about the context of user enumeration, right? Or identity information. Because the more of that information out there, to your point, that you literally just said was, the more of them I have, the higher my probabilities of success. And so I think that with that context in mind, giving out identity information for free is a much scarier thing, because it's the only thing standing between an inbox and by um, and downstream multiple application logins. So
Mhm.
it's kind of a big
Yeah,
deal.
and people love to say we have compensating controls in place such as MFA, and my follow-up question to that is what does your MFA deployment look like? Are you
Yes.
using number matching or are you just using push notifications? Because if you're using push notifications, I have a higher chance of breaking your MFA by just spamming your users because majority of them don't have rate limiting built in. So I can just
Yep.
sit there and click, click, click until finally they just break down and accept it. And then I'm in their account.
Yep.
Um, a lot of things
Well,
people don't realize as well is how often their internal users are using corporate emails for all their different services and
oh yeah.
things of that nature.
Hmm.
Like our dark web tool, you asked me to plug an email in the other day to check it to see if it had a comp password. And I did, and I saw it was their work email and it had been compromised 15 different times, 15 different, vendors that they had used that email for. So, the more emails I have, the more compromised credentials I have, the higher likelihood of attack I have. But people just think it's fine.
Yeah.
But those
Well,
compensating controls can just not do their job too.
and you're exactly right, dude. I mean, there have been cases in the past where we were doing external pen test and we did do a password spray, get an account, but that account hadn't been registered for MFA yet. And so like they globally enforce MFA across their entire user base, and some of the users just never log in from the outside. And so now it's waiting on a successful login to set up MFA. So we, of course, I'm like, yeah, dude, here's my phone, dude. Let's set up MFA right now. And then we're in, right? And there's another scenario that we see pretty regularly too, is where, depending on how you apply MFA as a policy, you may miss people.
Mm,
And you may unintentionally miss people, or in some cases, there are exceptions. And we see this a lot of times in law firms because, like, founding lawyers and people who are really important in the organization will sometimes ask for exceptions to security policies. And who's going to tell them no, right? They own the freaking firm.
mhm,
So I get that, but we'll end up catching one of those accounts that just is an exception because, for whatever reason, whether, again, unintentional, in some cases it's applied incorrectly and it just misses entire groups of people. In other cases it's applied correctly, but there are exceptions intentionally. But my point is this, just like what you're saying, MFA is not a singular silver bullet to solve the problem of identity protection. It is one thing in a layer of things that must be stacked in order to effectively protect those. And those things include monitoring for risky sign-ins. They include watching for credential sprays,
mm.
and password attacks. They also include things like conditional access. But even that is not an end all, dude. We're already telling you what city they live in on the website. So how hard is it for me to spin up, a VPN in their neighborhood and get an IP close to them that's going to geolocate? So, I mean, we can bypass any one of these mechanisms. Bypassing all of them is usually a challenge for us, which is why we encourage. I think in the finding that you wrote for user enumeration, there's like four things. Do all of these things
Mhm.
if you're gonna, if you're gonna allow for this enumeration to take place. So,
A lot of people just completely skip over conditional access policies. And that's probably the biggest point of protection because if you have it set to where your users can only log in from certain devices that are approved, you completely take a pen tester out of the equation because, I don't know what to spoof to get that same
yeah.
ID. So things like that. But a story I thought of while you were talking about that was a law firm we tested against maybe beginning of this year, and I was spraying passwords, and one of the passwords that I hit multiple users with, and it was because it was their internal process that if user forgot their password, they had to ask IT to reset it, and then IT had a set password that they sent that user to reset with. And so one of the people that I compromised doing that, their company was utilizing OpenVPN. And so that password got reset across the board, went to OpenVPN, authenticated,
Oh
and that's where I
no.
got the MFA prompt because that user still hadn't set it up. And so that was, my 3-step way straight into their internal environment.
Yep, that's how we make an external into an internal, dude. And it does happen, man. I mean, I'm probably maybe a dozen times this year we've run into accounts in environments that we were able to get into despite all of these other supposed compensating controls. Again, exceptions, misattribution, stuff like that. It's tough, man. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. We really appreciate you guys listening in. If you have any questions, there should be some links in the description if you want to reach out to us. And we really appreciate everything that you guys do for us. And we'll see you next Wednesday.